Evelyn Harper never believed in curses, and Marcus Kane had never feared the dark until the night they found the drum. It wasn't in a forgotten corner of the attic or buried beneath dust in a cellar. It was waiting for them, calling to them, promising something they couldn't resist. The first thump echoed like a heartbeat, soft and distant, and yet it reached straight into their chests. By the time they realized the rhythm wasn't tea coming from the drum, it was coming from inside them. It was already too late. I never expected to find something that could change my life so quietly, so subtly, yet so completely. The drum was tucked in the far corner of a small thrift shop I had never noticed before. Its wood was cracked, dust covering the surface like a thin layer of ash, yet it seemed to call to me in a way I couldn't explain. I reached out, running my fingers over the worn wood, and immediately a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't cold from the air. It was cold as if it had been waiting for me, as if it had been lonely and knew I would come. I felt the weight of it in my hands, heavier than it should have been, and I carried it home, careful not to drop it, careful not to disturb whatever it held inside. I placed it in my apartment in the corner by the window, where the moonlight hit it at night. The room felt different immediately, though I tried to convince myself it was only my imagination. The air seemed heavier, thicker, as though the drum had pressed itself into every shadow and crevice of my apartment. That night, I didn't touch it. I didn't play it. I just sat across the room, staring, feeling the unease crawl over my skin. The first sound came hours later, soft and subtle, almost polite. A thump. My pulse raced, my mind screaming that it had to be my imagination. I stood circling the drum, checking the floor, the walls, even under the furniture. Nothing. I was alone. I returned to bed, hoping sleep would come, but it didn't. The thump came again, slightly louder this time, then a second, then a steady rhythm. It was deliberate, purposeful, not random at all. It was like a heartbeat. But whose heartbeat? I tried to shake it off, pulling the blanket over my head, but the sound seemed to vibrate through the walls, through the floor, into my chest. I couldn't ignore it. My eyes, wide open, locked on the drum, and then the sound stopped. Silence. Not the peace of quiet, but the silence of holding one's breath. I thought about throwing it away the next morning, dumping it somewhere far from me, but something inside me stopped me. I couldn't. There was a fascination I couldn't explain, a compulsion that tugged at my chest every time I looked at it. I began noticing small things I hadn't before. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker, curling slightly toward the drum. The air smelled faintly of wet soil and smoke, though my apartment had no plants and no fireplace. When I touched the drum, it felt alive, not like wood, like something beneath the surface, moving. That night I tried to sleep again, leaving the lights on this time. The rhythm started earlier, softer, like a whisper at first, then gradually louder, insistent. I lay in bed, frozen, staring at the drum. I didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply. Each pulse felt like it was echoing in my very veins, syncing with me, making my heartbeat match its rhythm. And then I saw it. Small, almost imperceptible, faint handprints across its surface. Tiny, delicate, smeared with something dark and sticky. My hands shook as I reached toward them, but when I touched the drum, the prints vanished, leaving only the smooth, worn surface I had first seen. I couldn't leave my apartment. I couldn't throw it away. The drum had begun to grow inside my thoughts. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind against the window made me flinch. I started sleeping with one eye open, staring at the drum in case it moved, in case it called again. Sometimes, in the silence, I thought I saw its shadow stretch toward me, reaching, searching, wanting, and the thumping. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence. It was something alive in the room, something watching, something patient and hungry. When I finally managed to fall asleep, exhausted from the fear and the tension, I dreamt of drums everywhere, hundreds of them, beating in unison, drowning out everything else. I woke to find the air thick and heavy, and a faint, wet smell lingered in the room. I was shaking, heart pounding, when I noticed the final, most disturbing detail of all, a small, pale handprint on the inside of the window. I lived alone. I had no visitors. And yet there it was, pressed faintly into the glass, as if someone, or something, had been watching me sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the drum. Every moment I wasn't staring at it, I felt a pull in my chest, a weight that dragged my thoughts back to its cracked surface. I spent the entire day searching online, desperate to find any mention of it, any clue as to where it had come from or why it felt so alive. There was nothing, no records, no history, no maker's mark. Only vague warnings scattered across obscure forums, instruments haunted by spirits, drums cursed by long-dead musicians, warnings to never bring them into your home. At first, I laughed nervously at the absurdity. Haunted? Cursed? But a chill ran through me when I read one note in particular, written in hurried, shaky letters. Once it calls, it will not stop until it has claimed someone. That night, I tried to ignore it. I left the drum in the corner, pretending I didn't hear the faint thumping that had begun again, softer at first, teasing me, then louder, insistent. I kept my eyes on my laptop, hoping the sound would disappear if I refused to acknowledge it. It didn't. The rhythm began to change, slow and heavy, then quick and erratic, as if the drum itself was frustrated with my defiance. I could feel it in my chest now, vibrating through my bones, syncing with my heartbeat, and I realized with growing terror that I was no longer in control. My pulse was no longer mine. I stopped eating. I stopped going outside. Even the act of sleeping became impossible. The drum demanded attention, and I could feel its gaze even in the dark. The shadows in my apartment moved strangely when it thumped. Corners that had always been empty seemed to ripple and bend, pressing in toward the drum as though it were the center of some invisible force. I could sense it reaching out, testing the limits of my space, my sanity. It didn't take much for me to feel its presence, even when I wasn't in the same room. I knew it was watching, waiting for me to falter. One night, I woke in a cold sweat to silence. Relief washed over me, until I realized the silence was deliberate. I felt it before I heard it, a weight in the corner of the room, a pressure against the air like someone, or something, was crouched and waiting. My eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the apartment. Nothing. And then, the faintest scratch of wood against wood, a soft, wet sound, and the drum began to pulse again. Faster, louder, almost frantic. I could see its surface moving slightly, the cracked wood twisting as if it had flesh beneath it. The small handprints had returned, smeared across the surface, shifting as I watched, forming shapes that made no sense but sent ice through my veins. I tried to destroy it. I grabbed a hammer, swinging with all my strength, hitting the drum again and again. The wood splintered, cracked, and shards flew across the floor. But when I blinked, when I looked again, it was whole, pristine, lying innocently in the corner as if nothing had happened. The rhythm began anew, louder, more insistent, as though it had mocked my attempt. And beneath the rhythm I felt something else, a secondary pulse, faint, deep, slower, beneath my own heartbeat. It wasn't mine. It was something else, something living, breathing, watching. Sleep became a nightmare I could not wake from. I dreamt of drums inside drums, endless circles of wood, hollow and infinite. Faces stared out from their surfaces, screaming silently, eyes wide, mouths frozen open. Hands clawed at me from the dark inside the drum, and each thump made the visions sharper, more tangible. I awoke gasping, hands trembling, only to find the apartment unchanged, except for the smell. Wet earth and decay. Stronger now, clinging to the air like a living thing. The worst moment came when I noticed it. The drum had moved. I had left it in the corner before bed. Now it sat closer to me, angled as if it had turned its attention directly toward my bed. I felt its pulse through the floor, through the mattress, and a cold dread settled in my chest. On its surface, new symbols were carved. Letters I didn't recognize, jagged and writhing if I stared too long. My eyes hurt trying to read them, but I couldn't look away. They moved under my gaze, twisting into shapes, almost faces, screaming silently, their eyes hollow and accusatory. I realized then, with a panic that made me sick, that this was not an object. It was something alive, something patient and intelligent, watching me, studying me, learning me. And it had begun to call me, to claim me. My pulse was no longer my own, my thoughts invaded by its rhythm, every beat driving me closer to the edge. The handprints on the drum's surface, the movement of shadows, the weight of the air, they were all signs. I was trapped, and I had nowhere to run. And then I noticed a final, horrifying detail. A faint whispering, almost imperceptible, came from the drum. Not words I could understand, just breathy, gurgling sounds that seemed to crawl along the walls. It wasn't coming from the air, it was coming from inside me. By the third night, I had stopped keeping track of time. The drum had taken over my apartment, my thoughts, my life. I couldn't leave, not even to step into the hall. Every attempt to move toward the door felt like wading through thick, invisible molasses. The air itself seemed to resist me, pressing against my chest, curling around my limbs, holding me in place. The drum thumped steadily, predictably, like a heartbeat, and yet it was not my own. It was something else entirely, something patient, something hungry. I had started seeing it even when I closed my eyes. In the darkness behind my eyelids, shapes swirled. Thin, elongated shadows curling toward me, clawing at the edges of my vision. My reflection in mirrors no longer looked like me. The eyes staring back were hollow, black as ink, and their gaze followed me no matter which way I turned. At first, I thought it was a trick of sleep deprivation, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But even in the harsh light of day, the reflections persisted, subtle but unmistakable. The drum's influence had begun to seep into reality itself. I tried to ignore it, tried to sleep in another room, tried to focus on my phone, on books, on anything to distract myself. None of it worked. The drum pulsed even when I wasn't in the same room. Its rhythm filled the apartment like a living organism. I could feel it beneath my feet, inside the walls, in the floorboards, vibrating through my bones. My pulse matched its rhythm before I even realized it, my own heartbeat synchronized with the drum's sinister chant. And the shadows. The shadows moved with the rhythm, stretching, curling, pressing closer to the drum as if obeying it. I became obsessed. I watched the drum constantly, unable to look away. I tried to destroy it again, this time with fire. I set a small match to the cracked wood, but the flame caught only briefly before extinguishing itself. Smoke rose in wisps, curling over the drum as if nothing had happened, leaving it intact and gleaming faintly in the dim light. The thumping continued, louder, faster, more deliberate, and I realized with sickening clarity that it had learned from me, studied me. It knew my weaknesses. It knew my fear. Then came the first real touch. I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, to the feeling of something small, cold, and impossibly light brushing across my bare arm. My heart froze. I froze. Nothing should have been there. No one was in the apartment. But the sensation lingered, crawling across my skin like insects, until I jumped upright and the thumping slammed through me, almost violent in its insistence. When I looked toward the drum, it was closer to my bed than before, angled just so, as if it had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment. I couldn't sleep anymore. The drum's pulse had become a chant inside my head, a rhythm I could feel echoing through my very blood. Every thump resonated in my skull, every vibration in my chest, every silent scream in the shadows filling my vision. I could sense something crouched near the walls at night, just beyond sight, moving in time with the drum, a presence that was alive, intelligent, and malevolent. I would catch glimpses out of the corner of my eye, thin, pale shapes, crouched and still, always just beyond full vision. One night, the worst happened. I awoke to silence. Relief, fleeting and fragile, filled me. And then I felt it, breathing, not my own, slow and deliberate, deep and cold. Right behind me. I dared not turn. My body was paralyzed with fear, frozen in place. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating, until the drum began again. First softly, almost teasingly, and then a rhythm I could no longer distinguish from the thump of my own heart. And then I realized, with a terror so complete it made me shiver uncontrollably, that beneath it, beneath my own pulse, I could feel another heartbeat. It was small, soft, patient, waiting. The final horror of that night was the drum's surface itself. The cracks were moving. They twisted, opening and closing, revealing shapes underneath. Tiny faces, pale, hollow-eyed, screaming without sound. Hands pressed out from the wood, reaching, clawing, grasping. And then, the small handprints appeared on my bed, tiny and wet, as if something had been climbing toward me while I slept. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I could feel the drum pulsing beneath me, beneath everything, as if the world itself had become a vessel for its rhythm. I understood then that I was not dealing with a simple object or even a haunting. The drum was alive, a being that learned, adapted, and consumed attention, fear, and time. I was trapped, tethered to it by every thump that echoed in my chest, by every shadow that shifted in its rhythm. I had no idea how much longer I could survive. The thought alone made the air tighten around me, pressing into my lungs. The drum waited, patient, relentless, and I knew in the deepest part of myself that it was only getting started. By the fourth night, I had stopped pretending that I had any control over my life. The drum had claimed my apartment, my thoughts, my body. Every corner of the room seemed alive with its presence. Even when I wasn't looking, I felt its pulse vibrating through the floorboards, crawling along the walls, settling into my chest like an uninvited guest I could not shake. I could no longer leave. Every time I approached the door, it slammed shut as if laughing at my attempts. Windows refused to open. Locks clicked into place without my touch, and I realized the apartment was no longer mine. It belonged to the drum. The shadows had grown bold. They stretched along the walls, crawling toward the drum in sync with its steady rhythm, dark, twisted shapes that seemed to move of their own will. Sometimes I caught glimpses of figures crouched in corners, pale, thin, almost childlike, their eyes hollow and accusing. They vanished when I tried to focus on them, leaving only the sense of being watched, hunted, and measured. I no longer slept. Sleep had become a weapon the drum used against me, filling my dreams with endless visions of its power. I spent the day pacing, trying to force my mind away from it, but even the simplest thoughts were invaded. Its rhythm had become a chant inside me, a language I couldn't understand but was starting to learn. I could feel the shape of it, the contours of its hunger, pressing into my mind. It pulsed faster when I panicked, slower when I froze, and I realized with a sick understanding that it fed on my fear, shaping it, molding it, driving me toward something I didn't dare predict. And then I saw it. At first, it was only a flicker in the corner of my eye, a thin, crouched shadow against the wall. My heart stopped. It looked like a child, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers too thin, its head too large, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes. They were hollow black pits that seemed to swallow the room. It mimicked the drum's rhythm with its body, small movements perfectly timed to each beat. And then it raised one hand and pointed directly at me, a slow, deliberate motion, perfectly synchronized with the drum's pulse. My chest tightened. I could barely breathe. I tried to scream, my voice caught in my throat. I ran toward the kitchen, thinking somehow I could escape, thinking I could smash the drum one last time. But the moment I stepped forward, the air itself thickened, resisting me, pressing into my skin and lungs. The drum flew across the room on its own, landing in the center like a predator claiming its prey. Its surface shimmered faintly, black veins crawling across the wood, alive, as if it had blood beneath it. The rhythm exploded in my chest, deafening, relentless. My own heartbeat was no longer mine. It had become part of the chant, part of the drum's endless hypnotic pulse. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, overwhelmed by the sound, the weight, the presence. The shadow crouched in the corner moved closer, thin legs sliding silently along the walls. I could feel its gaze boring into me, and with a chill I couldn't shake, I realized it wasn't alone. The room was full of them now, crouched in corners, behind furniture, pressed into the walls, small, pale figures that mirrored the drum, each one moving perfectly in time with the rhythm. Their eyes were hollow, their faces frozen in expressions of silent terror, and each beat of the drum sent a jolt of fear through my body, as if it could touch my soul. The worst part was the realization that I was not safe anywhere, not even in my own head. The chant had invaded my mind completely. I could hear voices, whispers beneath the pulse, words I didn't understand, but which felt like commands. Shapes pressed against the edges of my vision, moving closer every moment. I felt my sanity slipping, dissolving into the rhythm, becoming one with it, and yet I wanted to fight, wanted to survive, wanted to escape. But there was nowhere to go. Then, as if sensing my desperation, the shadow crouched nearest to me raised its hand again, and the drum pulsed harder, louder, almost violently. I could feel something reaching toward me, cold, insistent, crawling over my skin like icy fingers. My mind screamed, my body trembled, and I realized in a moment of utter terror that the drum had chosen me, not just as an observer, not just as prey, but as its next vessel. It was patient, it was hungry, and I was already trapped, tethered to its rhythm in ways I could not hope to escape. I knew by the fifth night that I could not survive the drum's presence any longer, but the thought of abandoning it filled me with paralyzing fear. I had already tried to destroy it, tried to leave it behind, and each failure had taught me one horrifying truth. It was not an object, it was a being, a living, patient, intelligent predator that had claimed my life long before I realized it. My pulse was no longer my own, every beat synchronized perfectly with its rhythm. My thoughts were no longer private, its whispers slithered inside my skull. I had become part of the drum, tethered by something invisible yet unbreakable. I attempted one final escape. I crept toward the door, step by trembling step, praying that somehow the apartment would release me, that I could abandon this nightmare and never look back. The drum sat in the corner, silent, seemingly harmless for once. But I knew better. The instant I crossed the threshold, the air thickened, pressing into my chest, my limbs, my throat. The drum flew across the room with a force that made the walls shudder, landing at my feet. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, black veins crawling along the wood like living veins. I froze. The thumping began almost immediately, louder, more insistent than it had ever been. I sank to the floor, unable to move, unable to breathe. The rhythm filled my head, vibrating through my bones, rattling my teeth, forcing my pulse to match it perfectly. And then I felt it. Small, cold hands gripping my ankles, crawling upward with impossible speed. I tried to scream, to shake them off, but my voice was trapped inside me. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched, writhing, coming closer with every pulse, until the figures crouched there, thin, pale, childlike, rose in unison, moving perfectly with the drum's rhythm. I could see their hollow eyes glinting in the dim light, and I realized with a sick clarity that they were not separate from the drum. They were part of it. extensions of its will, its hunger, its pulse. The rhythm became unbearable, deafening in my skull, vibrating through every nerve, every fiber of my being. My mind fractured, visions exploding behind my eyelids, faces screaming silently from within the drum, hands clawing from its surface, shadows writhing along the walls as if the apartment itself had come alive. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging me toward the drum, and in the darkness behind my eyes, I saw the final horror. A small, pale figure crouched before me, raising its hand in perfect imitation of the drum's pulse. And when it pointed directly at me, I realized with horror that the drum had learned me, mimicked me, and now it was ready to claim me entirely. Then, in a moment of impossible clarity, I understood. The drum did not just feed on fear, it fed on life, on the rhythm of existence itself. I was already half inside it, my pulse and thoughts merging with its rhythm. I could feel it extending beyond the apartment, into the city, reaching toward others, waiting for the next heartbeat it could devour. Panic surged, but I could not move. My body was mine in name only. The drum had woven itself into my very being. I awoke, or perhaps I didn't awaken, outside the apartment. The night was calm, quiet, almost peaceful. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a fleeting moment I thought I had escaped. But then I heard it, faint at first, a pulse beneath the darkness, echoing inside me. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythm was mine, yet it wasn't. I looked down at my hands and saw faint black veins crawling along my skin, almost imperceptible, pulsing in sync with the beat. The drum was gone from my apartment, but it was no longer contained. Every shadow I passed seemed to twitch in time with the rhythm. Every distant sound carried it faintly, beneath the wind, beneath the hum of the city. I tried to run, tried to scream, but the rhythm was inside me, relentless, patient, infinite. And then I realized the most horrifying truth. I was now a vessel, a carrier, a link in the drum's chain, spreading its pulse to the next person who would listen, the next life it could claim. Even now, as I write this, I can feel it beneath my ribs, echoing in my chest. Thump, thump, thump. It waits, patient, hungry, everywhere and nowhere at once, seeking another heartbeat to join its endless, eternal rhythm. I cannot escape it. I am not alone, and I never will be again. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the city, I know the drum waits too, patient, watching, pulsing, ready for the next person who dares to hear its call.